So thank you to Barbara and Rob and the HERDSA New Zealand branch for inviting me to do this webinar on blended writing. I am going to be talking about bringing the material into the digital world and vice versa, I suppose. And so I'm well aware that we are in the digital space right now, and yet we're all sitting in our individual material spaces. So this is why right at the beginning, I really love it if you would all, unless you have some reason you just can't do it, I would love it if you'd put your video on just for a minute and show us where you are, or if you have a virtual screen, that's fine, with penguins and beaches and things in the background. I've got my very material writing companion, Freddie, here with me, my little dog, whom you may or may not hear from during the day if he sees a cat outside. For me, it's been actually one of the pleasures of, in this very strange time of moving into this Zoomiverse, that we are seeing people's children and pets and their study spaces and all these other things coming into our conversational spaces in a way that they never have before. So can we all maybe just give each other a wave, acknowledge human beings out there in the world? And you might also take a moment to kind of sit back, breathe, and look around. I've come to think of the computer screen as being kind of like that wardrobe in the Chronicles of Narnia. You know, it's that doorway that takes us into another world. And when we get into the other world, it's all consuming. There's nothing else. We forget that world that we came from. But then we step back at some point and it's like, oh, whoa, right. That's what it was about. What I'd like to encourage us to do today is to think about ways of leaving that door open and of kind of coming back and forth through it and remaining conscious of it. And part of that means then being mindful of our surroundings, being mindful of the materiality that we bring with us every time we turn on that screen and kind of turn off our bodies, it sometimes feels like, even if we're still tapping our fingers. So I'm going to move now. You're welcome to turn off your screen for most of this if you'd prefer to, but please, if you have questions, write them into the chat. Rob will be keeping an eye on that so that we can have time for some questions and discussion at the end. And I'll be mostly, I'm putting it on speaker view now, and I'll be mostly showing you some slides, which you'll probably see best if you have them in speaker mode as well. So I'm going to do a share here and take you over to PowerPoint on blended writing. So when Barbara asked me back in about, I don't know, May, June, whether I do this webinar and could I please come up with a title and blurb for it, what was very much on my mind at the time, we were all still in the midst of getting used to this idea of the lockdowns and this new mode of teaching. And so I was thinking about, I came up with the term blended writing as an intentional kind of analog to blended teaching. Turns out that blended writing is a term that's already used by some people in kind of composition studies and practice for writing that blends genres. So if you're trying to bring together non-academic and academic modes into a single text, something like that, that's sometimes referred to as blended writing. In the context of this webinar, what I mean is something that's much more akin to blended teaching, which is writing that is both digital and real world, possibly shared in both and created in both synchronous and asynchronous ways. So I was trying to get my head around all that, and where does blended writing sit with blended learning or blended teaching? Probably should say blended learning here is the phrase we hear a bit more often. I think until recently, most of us thought of blended learning as being a mode of teaching, a mode of kind of classroom delivery, where we had a mix or a blend of synchronous face-to-face teaching in the classroom, and then synchronous online teaching. So you'd be in the classroom, then you'd go off and you'd do your online assignments in your own time. And those are the two things that are blended. But then COVID came along and made us think differently about pretty much everything. And a lot of us ended up doing something that was more online but synchronous. So we would still be giving our lectures or running our classes in real time with a group of students who were sort of there but sort of not there. And that's the mode we're in right now. We're synchronous online. And I also heard instances of people who did asynchronous face-to-face learning. So for example, students who might be in a situation where their university was shut down, they couldn't go to classes, but they could still meet in small groups. So they would actually meet in study groups with their friends to get some human contact outside of the formal teaching. So our idea of blended teaching and blended learning, I think, has opened up in this this time of the new Zoom-iverse. And I don't know about the rest of you, but I've found Zoom, I mean, I know people complain about Zoom fatigue, the way you feel if you're on it for too many hours or too many meetings or whatever. But it's also opened up a lot of things. And one of the things I love about it is that there is a kind of intimacy to it that's possible, that wasn't really possible in previous modes that I've experienced, at least, of doing blended teaching and learning. So it brought some new ways of doing things for many of us. So thinking about blended writing, I'm talking about another aspect then, which isn't so much face-to-face versus online, synchronous versus asynchronous, but digital and analog, or you could say digital and material writing. So when we talk about digital and analog in that context means anything that is not powered by computer code. But basically, I'm thinking there's the digital universe inside the screen, all the things that we can do with writing when it's digitalized, like search and replace functions, online editing, Google Docs, all those sorts of things. And then the material side of writing is, you know, the old notebook and pen, or the document that you print out and you actually mark up by hand, or things around the writing where you have a consciousness of your writing space, your desk, all of the things that are part of our world of writing. Of course, this is a bit of a false dichotomy because everything digital is also material to some extent. Computers are real. Even the way that the code, the way that things are transmitted relies on material networks. So we can't really put a totally clear dividing line between them. But most of us, I think it's still a useful way to think about how do we bring more materiality into digital writing, and why? Why might we want to do that? And so here we'd be thinking really about all of these possibilities, all of those possibilities that I broached with blended teaching, blended learning, we would also want to explore with blended writing. So let me give you a little bit of background on why and how I've been thinking about this. I'm a literary scholar by trade, I guess, but about 13, 14 years ago, I started writing about academic writing across the disciplines. And that's really become my main, almost exclusive research area now. So I wrote first a very small book, The Writer's Diet, that's very much about sentences, sentence structure. But that got me interested in larger questions of academic writing. So then I wrote Stylish Academic Writing, which basically tries to prove that its title is not necessarily an oxymoron, and to show that it's possible to write stylishly in any discipline. I always tell people, if you don't like the word stylish, replace it with engaging. So how can we write engagingly for our own scholarly audiences or for audiences beyond academe? And that book then in turn led me to Air, Enlightened Time and Space, How Successful Academics Write. And that one's much less about the writing and more about the writers. So for that one, I interviewed 100 successful academic writers with success very broadly defined, and I collected questionnaire data from over 1,200 writers in 15 countries around the world or something like that, academic writers, about how they write, how they learn to write as academics, and how they feel about their writing. So that was a brief overview of the last 15 years of my life. What I'm working on now has come out of that last book. I became particularly interested in the emotions around academic writing. And I found that the people I interviewed talked about the pleasures of writing. They talked about writing as being hard, challenging, but also pleasurable. And yet there's almost no literature on the positive emotions around academic writing and why they might be important and even essential to cultivate. So I'm working now on a book called Writing with Pleasure. And the idea of that book is to be a sort of source book of pleasure, to show writers all the different ways you can bring pleasure into your writing practice, into your serious academic writing practice. So the research that I've been doing for that book, I again traveled around to 10 countries, I think it was, back when I could still travel. And I asked academics, so these were all pretty much all PhD students or academic staff, or in some cases, non-academic staff, but who work in universities and in many cases do research and do their own writing. And I asked them to write for 10 minutes about a time in their lives when writing gave them pleasure. So these are the instructions. 10 minutes of free writing, a time in your life when you've associated writing with pleasure. And I specifically prompted them to write about the material setting they were in, to tell me what kind of writing they were doing, specifically academic or non-academic. I was very interested in knowing what writing tools they were using, so computers or handwriting, sensory details, other people, and then why, where was the pleasure here? So I collected almost 600 of these questionnaires, which means I've got a lot of data and a lot of stories, wonderful stories of where writers find pleasure in their writing and when, at what stages in their lives and in what kind of writing. And the answer is everywhere. Different people have found pleasure in different places, but it is everywhere for somebody. It's been quite a fun project. So I was interested to know how many people would choose, because they can only choose one example generally. And so it's going to be the first thing they think of, a time in their life when writing gave them pleasure. And so would they think of something academic, or would they think of non-academic writing? And academic meant not just higher education or beyond, but also, you know, if when you were 12 years old, it was a school assignment, that would count as academic writing. So here's the response out of 563 people who responded to that. About half basically chose to write about academic writing as the kind of writing that gave them pleasure, and about half non-academic. And that covered the whole gamut from creative writing to writing letters, writing blog posts. It wasn't just what we think of as creative writing. And in some cases, journalistic writing, kind of professional writing. And then the writing tools, I was really interested in that. So how many of them wrote on a computer or some kind of electronic device versus how many went old school, wrote by hand, used material kind of methods of writing. And I think I probably expected that to kind of be half-half as well. But here's what that pie chart looked like. About 20% of the people, so a sizable number, actually wrote about both, using both, usually for the same writing project. So that might be something like putting a whole bunch of Post-it notes on the wall, while you're thinking through your project, and then turning those into something that you type up. Or it might be typing something up and then you print it out and you mark it up with colored pencils. It might be something where you drafted in a notebook first and then you went and you typed it in, and then maybe you printed it out and went back and did some more drafting. So already a sizable percentage of people who are doing this kind of blended writing, they're bringing material or analog methods in with their digital ones. So then I thought, well, is there a correlation between the analog digital and the academic non-academic? And I was interested in the different forms of pleasure that were coming through in these stories as well. I started to notice that people who were telling me stories of writing with a computer very often didn't write a whole lot about their surroundings. The pleasure that they would write about was an intellectual pleasure, a cognitive pleasure. So they would write, this isn't 100%, but it was definitely a trend that a lot of these people, the pleasure of writing on the computer was that the computer didn't get in the way. It was almost like a transparent device and the ideas were just flowing down, and it was that flow of the ideas where the pleasure sat. On the other hand, a lot of the people who wrote about writing with notebooks or writing material letters and putting them in an envelope, or those things that were more tactile, a lot of the pleasure seemed to be in the physicality. So they were less likely to write that it gave them pleasure because of the ideas and the thinking, and more likely to write that a big part of the pleasure was the setting and the pleasure of the pen crossing the page and the pleasure of licking the envelope and all those sorts of things. So I wondered, would this then kind of fall out to academic versus non-academic, digital versus analog? And it sort of did and sort of didn't, I guess. So the dark blue, the 43% academic writing that used a digital method, either exclusively or in combination. The dark green is non-academic writing that used analog tools, either exclusively or in combination with digital ones. And then these smaller percentages where it was purely non-academic and purely digital, or purely academic and purely analog. So I think that shows us that my hunch was pretty much borne out, I think, by the data, that when we're on our computers, very often the pleasures are intellectual. When we're writing with a pen, with a notebook, doing these things that sort of slow us down, the pleasures are very much material. And to me, that suggests, and this is something, again, I see a lot in the stories from those 20% who are using mixed methods, doing that blended writing, that the pleasure for them is coming from both together, right? So you want to bring together the intellectual and the physical pleasures, mix the computer, the digital, with the analog. So that for me is one of the many justifications for blended writing, for wanting to encourage our students to do it, wanting to encourage maybe our colleagues, and for using it ourselves, for kind of blending the methods in our own writing. It brings more intellectual and creative energy to the work we're doing. And there's all kinds of neuropsychology and behavioral psychology and many other studies from many other fields that bear out the thinking behind that, which I won't have time to go into, but I will have a long bibliography in my book when I write it. So I'd like to just talk you through a few examples of how this might work. For the book, though, I'll show you first the kind of rubric that I've developed that I'm using to structure my book on writing with pleasure. It's something I call the space of pleasure. And I would propose or argue that we perform at our best, and I'm thinking of something like Csikszentmihalyi's idea of flow. We are in the flow. We're really being creative and bringing everything to tasks when we have some combination of being socially connected, physically engaged, aesthetically nourished, creatively and cognitively challenged, so that's that intellectual part, and just emotionally uplifted. We're having fun. Not all of these elements have to be present at the same time, but it seems to me that if we want to bring pleasure into our writing, a very good way to go about it is to try to attend to these 5 dimensions of writing. And likewise, if we want to bring pleasure to our students' writing or give colleagues ideas for how to bring pleasure to their own writing. Why pleasure? Well, that's a whole other story, but I firmly believe and have plenty of research to back up the notion that pleasure and productivity are very much tightly linked. So if you want to be more productive, find ways of taking pleasure in writing. Also, another thing that's come out of my research is finding very few people write about a time, their favorite writing time, the time in their life when it gave them pleasure. Very few write about experiences as undergraduates. And I find that really interesting. People start to get the pleasure back when they move into postgrad and are really stuck into research projects. People have a lot of pleasure writing school level assignments, but undergraduate writing, not so much. And that's something I think that all of us who are educators and teach undergraduates or work with teachers of undergraduates really had to think about. Do we want to have students who think that writing, thinking about writing, improving writing is akin to eating your vegetables, something that you have to take seriously, but you can't be expected to enjoy? I'd like to bring pleasure and enjoyment into undergraduate writing, because that's then how you can get the intellectual energy in. So 3 examples of blended writing that I'd like to show you. One from kind of academic development, one from undergraduate teaching, and then the third one, I'll show you some resources I've been developing for writers and how I've tried to use these ideas in there. All of these examples come from my own work. That's only because when I give a talk like this, I like to use it as a way of working through my ideas and my thinking. So I'm testing these ideas against my own work, but I could find many, many examples from others, other teachers, other writers, and other researchers that would affirm these same ideas. So this is another way of looking at the space of writing, and you see how when you go from the bullet points, the academic bullet points, to the color and form, let a little bit of visual and aesthetic pleasure in there, the whole thing kind of pops into a different mode. So how do we get writers into this space of pleasure? How do we make the space of writing a space of pleasure? So this is something that I was experimenting with soon after we went into lockdown back in April. I had all these plans for traveling, as usual, going and running workshops around the world, and I had to do a pretty quick pivot to thinking about how to do some of those same things online. So one thing I did back in, I think, May, was I ran a series of virtual writing cafes. And there were 3 of them because I did them over 3 days in at 3 different times, so that I could offer them for people in any time zone anywhere in the world. And that was really fun and really interesting. I got people signing up from something like 35 different countries. So even thinking about synchronous versus asynchronous in terms of global accessibility has become kind of an interesting idea for me now. So what is a virtual writing cafe? Well, I wanted to create an online environment where you could come for 2 hours and you'd be in the company of other writers. So that's that social aspect. You would get some writing done, so that intellectual work would be going on there. But you'd also be doing it in a blended mode, so that you're both in the virtual space, but you're also very much in your own real world. So how did I do that? Well, when people first arrived, well, for a start, I'm always very careful about how I set up my camera. You know, I want to have a nourishing, creative, colorful setting for when I'm teaching or when I'm running something like this. So it's not a cafe, it's my own place on Waiheke Island, but I'm very conscious of bringing people into a space where they'll want to be. And then I did just what I did with you, asked people to put their cameras on. We had some hellos coming through the chat. I asked people to bring coffee, tea, to bring notebooks, to bring their material selves into this virtual presence. And over again, I asked them to share those things that they brought with them. So here, the notebook and the pen. And then when I asked them to do some writing, we used the Pomodoro technique, which many of you will know. That's the idea that you have a tomato-shaped timer, hence the Pomodoro, that you set for a set period of time, usually 25 minutes, while everybody does some writing. And sure, I could have set up a digital timer, or I could set up an actual tomato timer. So this was on the screen while people typed and was actually ticking down. It's just a small thing, but it's just bringing those little elements of materiality in there. And then after people had done their hour of writing, I took them through a little editing exercise, and I'd also taken them through a warm-up that they did in their notebooks with their pens, again, blending the modes of writing. So if they'd done some typing, they also would have done some handwriting. If they wanted to, they could do some mind mapping, sketching. So that's the blended writing in that virtual writing cafe. Another example comes from some teaching that I've done over the years that I would not describe as being blended learning. That is, it's been mainly in a face-to-face kind of context. But I've been thinking, I'm on research leave this year, so I didn't teach it during COVID, but I have been thinking about for the next academic year, how I'm going to teach it, being conscious that everything could all shut down at any moment and have to go fully online. So this is an undergraduate paper that I teach with a colleague that's on modernist poetry, early 20th century poetry. And you can see faces of a few people you might recognize, like T.S. Eliot and Virginia Woolf and Yeats. And in this course, the students don't just submit standard academic essays, which are black words on white paper, and these days submitted digitally. So they're not even printed out on white paper. They're just in that mode that mimics white paper. But in this course, the students do really hands-on material engagements with the poetry. So their final assignment, they have to create an anthology of 5 poems that we've read across the semester. They need to come up with a theme that links all of the poems, and they need to create a physical anthology that somehow speaks to, emphasizes, perhaps subverts and undermines that theme. And then they have to write about it. So there's still the standard paper that goes with it, but these papers are so much more interesting because instead of writing this standard academese kind of essay where they're trying to sound really, like serious English majors, they get to write about what they did and why and how they engaged with these poems in a very material way. So just some examples of the kinds of things that students then present. And we have a show and tell day where they bring these in. And you can see a bouquet, an anthology, that means it's from the Greek word for flower. So it's literally a bouquet of texts, record, albums some people made, things that you can unpack, a hat box that you can unpack, a lamp that gets illuminated, and they were all poems about light. And then probably my very favorite of all time was a student who brought in a piñata. If you can see it there, it's that little globe. It's a globe-shaped piñata on a stick, and he brought a baseball bat, which caused some consternation when he carried on the public bus. And then he had 2 students hold the pole while he bashed the piñata open. And these were all poems that were about kind of globalization, and he smashed the globe open, and then the poems came falling down. And then he wrote the paper that explained how he done it and why, and how that actual sort of live performance piece helped him understand, and he thought would help his readers understand what was going on in this poetry. So I've been thinking, well, this is already blended mode, right? They're bringing the texts into the material world and then bringing them back again, typing things up that they submit electronically. How would I do it if face-to-face isn't possible? It wouldn't be that hard. The students would still get the same assignments. They'd still meet in groups, but via Zoom to show each other what they're doing, to give each other support, talk through their ideas. And there would still be a show and tell session, probably synchronous, where they would come and one by one, they would hold their books and their things up to the camera. This guy would have had to get, I don't know, a few friends or family members maybe to stage the piñata thing. And if we couldn't do it synchronously for some reason, everybody could photograph or film, and he could still film the piñata performance and upload that for others to see. And I just think as soon as we have that materiality coming in there, the students' enjoyment and engagement just pops open, and they become so much more interested in the poetry and talking about the poetry. And so the intellectual side of their engagement is kind of going hand in hand with the creativity. So you can see all 5 elements of that space of pleasure, space of writing going on here: the social, the physical, the aesthetic. These are beautiful. The creative, cognitive, and then just the emotional, the sense of the fun that's happening here. The third example that I want to show you is work that I've been doing this year during the year of no travel and COVID, thinking about bringing resources for writers into the world through mainly electronic means, and how to bring this sense of materiality to resources that people are going to be experiencing purely on their computer screens. So I'm going to end that share right here and then go to a new one. And what I'm going to do is take you to my my website that I launched this in April this year, and show you some of the tools that I've been working on here. So this is my website. It's at helensword.com. I call it a resources for writers website. And you can see right away that the way it's set up, each of the main categories that you can go to, which are also up here in the navigation bar, I have for each of them a thumbnail. And kind of my overall theme for this website is that every one of those thumbnails has something from the material world. And in most cases, it's a piece of art. I'm not sure you could call the purple cow plastic timer that I bought from China for about $4 a work of art. Oh, but the glasses are the bohemian glasses, I suppose. But all of these other things are actual physical works of art. In most cases, things that I own, that I've bought from the artists or been given, or in the case of the one down here, it's a mosaic that I made myself. This was a collaborative project, the one with the bird, that I did the poetry and a visual artist did the artwork, including that beautiful bird. So what I'm trying to do, even with the whole look and feel of the website, is to bring the material world and the pleasures, the aesthetic pleasures of the material world and materiality around writing, you can see in some of these, and reading, into the digital space right from the get-go, from the moment you arrive here. And then as you go and you click into the different categories, for example, the one on writing communities, during lockdown back in April, I invited people on my email list to send in photos of their writing spaces in the time of COVID-19. And it was just a way of letting writers who were stuck at home all around the world kind of take a moment to share their spaces with other people. And they're beautiful, beautiful. And a lot of them have been set up. I love the ironing board. We have kids and dogs we have these layers of things. This one over here, that's one of my YouTube videos up on somebody's computer screen. So it becomes this kind of the mise en abîme, you know, like the hall of mirrors where you're looking at things. And so again, it's opportunities for people to bring material spaces of writing and to think about materiality coming into the digital space. I also launched a YouTube channel, quite possibly the scariest thing I've ever done as an academic. It's called Helen's Word. And here it is out here on YouTube. You can link to it. Oh, look, and there's Freddie. And here I have sections that are Pomodoro timers, and they're all very playful and fun and colorful. I have a section that are writing warm-ups where you can do a bit of handwriting to get ready to do more serious writing. And again, each has a sort of theme to it and some material object. And I also have others that I call the WordCraft workouts. They're much more kind of getting into your writing. But in most of them, I'm actually looking at printed out writing with a clipboard, with highlighters, and trying to bring that sense of materiality in. And I also have some writing challenges. So you can see that idea of the blended, and up here, this sort of spider webby pattern, the web designer who's been helping me with, the reason I chose her, I looked online to try to find a web designer whose work I liked. And the one I found is both a web designer and a weaver. And I love that. So she weaves webs, both in the digital and the material worlds. And I thought, okay, that's the person for me, suits that ethos. And then the one other category I want to show you are the tools. Again, that's an actual mosaic that I made in the real world. Then I photographed it and put it through a Photoshop filter, and it's up on the computer screen because it's part of one of a digital poem that I made, photographed on the computer. So we have all these layers of the material and the digital working together. And I just get so much more pleasure from that image than I would from one that shows all the kind of typical office-y things that you usually see when you see a picture of a laptop. The tools section of the website has links to an array of digital writing tools. That's my digital poetry site called the Stoneflower Path. I have something called the Writing Base, which came out of my book, Air, and Light, and Time and Space. You click on it and it takes you to a page where you can do a little self-diagnosis looking at your own writing habits in these 4 domains: behavioral, artisanal, social, and emotional. And you can, it's very tactile. You can pull on these things in answer to these questions over here, or you can pull on the bars here. And then once you have determined the shape of your base, you can click this thing called See Your Profile, and it will give you some additional information and ideas. Now, this is fully in the digital space, but it was developed as a paper exercise initially. I still sometimes ask people to do it as a paper exercise. And I tried to give the digital exercise a sense of that materiality. You have to take your mouse and move it around to make it work. Another tool that some of you may already have seen, the Writer's Diet, a new website here, but the Writer's Diet test is something where you can copy and paste in some of your own writing, click Run the Test, and you'll get a diagnosis of whether your writing is, quote, flabby or fit. The new version, you can change the theme. So this one's on swampy or solid. This particular one, which is from Leuven Wenger's very famous work, Situated Learning, has the diagnosis of quicksand. And then the Writer's Diet, the book, helps tell you how to dig your way out of the quicksand and get your reader back on solid ground. There's now a new app, an add-in for Microsoft Word that allows you for free. It's a free tool you can download, and you can use the Writer's Diet on a full document. And again, I'm showing you this one because I hope you can see in the way the tool works. Here's some screenshots, that I've used color, I've used a sense of highlighters, even physical highlighter colors. I've used a lot of these ideas of materiality that come from the material touch of writing to help people see their own writing differently as it lights up with these highlighter colors. And then I want to show you two tools that have been developed by colleagues of mine. One is Evia Trofimova's wonderful digital writing tools website. And you click onto that one and she's got 6 online spelling, grammar, style checkers that she's featured here, including the Writer's Guide as one of them. And it's worth running your mouse over them because they're all kinetic. These wonderful little sort of robots representing each one. And then when you click onto the page for each one, you'll get a description, and then you'll get a bunch of resources for teaching that tool with students. So the idea is to shift from saying to students, oh, go put your writing through the Writer's Guide before you turn it in, or put it through Grammarly, without giving the students any advice on what that means, without taking them through some kind of more reflective exercises about what are grammar and spelling checkers even doing, and how are they helping you or not? What are the things that are wrong with them? What are the ethical issues? And so the purpose of this site really is to bring, I guess, the materiality of getting students talking to each other about their writing into the classroom, real or virtual, and get these electronic tools that sit in virtual space and kind of surface them back into the real world. And then I'll show you just one more and we'll turn it over to your questions. This is a wonderful one called Smudge Skittle that was developed by my colleague Alice Longley, who's in dance and choreography. And there's an actual physical pack of cards that you can order via the website, but there's also, you can also do the whole thing digitally. So you can click into it and you get these cards, and you can see that, much as I've done on the website, everything has real world kind of pictures being brought into this digital space. And each card has a prompt for you or for your students to think about ways of doing critical writing in more creative ways. So they're all prompts for thinking about expanding your idea of what writing is and what it might be. Again, I love this because it's a physical resource that's also available as a digital resource. And yet I would say the way to use it most effectively would be to get hold of those cards and use it in a classroom if you could, to bring that material pleasure in. But if you can't do that, there are lots of ways I'm sure you could play with your students and find a way of, or colleagues, and find a way of using the digital pack of cards. So I will stop the share there and turn things over to Rob to see if we've got any questions or comments back here in the real world.
Thank you, Helen. Yeah, it's just been sort of scrolling through the comments as we've been talking. I'm sure other people have as well. And I think the sense that I'm getting is there's a lot of comments about appreciating all the resources that are out there, and people taking a lot of inspiration from all the work that you've done. So I just think a collective thank you from everybody for that. Yeah, it's wonderful. There are a couple of comments, and I'm sure there'll be some more that come out from the chat as well. And the first comment here, question rather, is from Gillian, who asks, do you also investigate blended editing, or is that an extension of blended writing? So I wondered if you'd like to talk to that.
Yeah, I can't say it's something that I've investigated exactly, but, and I don't have as many stories about editing in my data set as I would like to, because they were specifically asked about a time when writing gave them pleasure. So only a few people have actually talked about their work as editing, though a few have. They've talked about the pleasures of editing someone else's work, or in a few cases, the pleasures of having somebody else working through their work with them. I'm assuming here an editor who's a separate editor, and I just realized maybe the question is more about editing your own work. There will be a chapter or a section in my book on, well, they're on both really, but on the pleasures of the craft of writing, the crafting, which is that editing process. But also, I think most of us, when we think about being edited by other people or we're being peer reviewed, we don't think pleasure, do we? We immediately have this like, that's going to hurt. It's going to be harmful, painful. But I've heard many stories from people, especially when I was doing interviews with successful writers, about the great pleasure of having a really sympathetic editor's eye on your work. And that whole tactile side of editing, I think most of us have probably experienced and perhaps, have a certain nostalgia for as well. I find sometimes I need to remind myself to print things out and edit by hand just to save my eyes and my back and bring a different part of my brain in, because it's really easy to do everything on track changes. The tools are there. It's useful. If you're doing something like Google Docs, it makes sense. You never have to leave that little digital universe. And yet there's a whole bunch of not just pleasure, but I don't know, just there are ways in which too much time in that with the screen is actually bad for us as well. So I guess everything I say could be applied back to editing, whether it's your own work or you editing other people's work or other people editing yours. I would be thinking about bringing a blended mode into it and thinking about what are the electronic tools that we have that can be helpful for editing, and there are many, but also what are some of the aspects of that kind of old school scissors and highlighters and pens in margins that we might want to preserve and go back to.
Lovely, thank you, Helen. Sort of just picking up on the idea too about the tools. So I guess some people may not be familiar with the Writer's Diet. So there was a question there about whether it is, so it's just disappeared as people adding questions, whether it's freely available because it looks valuable.
Yeah, so the website writersdiet.com, you can cut and paste into the website between 100 and 1,000 words. So that's, anybody can do that as long as you have a web browser. Then the add-in, it's for Microsoft Word, so you have to have Word in some version, but there is a free version of Word on the cloud, and there are instructions for how to use that if you don't have access to Word in other ways. And the add-in, you install it from the Microsoft Store and it's completely free. The only issue is that some universities block you from downloading it. And if you look at the user guide, so it's the help section of the website, writersdiet.com, there's a whole bunch of information on workarounds. It ought to be something that is accessible to everyone one way or another, even if you have to go to the online version and open it with your Gmail account or something because your university won't let you use the other version. But yeah, and I should say here, it was philanthropically funded. It was a massive, it took me years to develop that thing because I can't do the software myself. I just have the ideas and I'm totally dependent on the coders. And so we had a philanthropic grant from a woman in Germany who was really interested in helping writers write more clearly. And that's how it's been able to be put out there for free.
Here's a really interesting question, Helen, to do with your research on the pleasure. And they've asked if, like to know, has your research covered the type of pleasure from writing that people get? So I think you've identified what gives people pleasure, and I'm just wondering if you've unpacked it a little bit more about what type of pleasure.
Well, I think in a way that space rubric helps you think about it a bit. Some people write about an intellectual pleasure. For some people, it is kind of a social pleasure of connecting with other people. For some people, there's an actual, the actual physical pleasure of the writing. A lot of people, the pleasure comes from, the pleasures from being praised or feeling like you've done something well. That's kind of hard to, even as I'm answering, I'm saying, is that the source of the pleasure or the type of pleasure? I think sometimes I'll have to go away and think about how that's kind of sorted out. But many different sources of pleasure and many different types of pleasure, I think it's fair to say. And I'm just trying to kind of catalog them all. I think we have plenty of books about how hard writing is and about all the pathologies of writing, about writer's block and about, lack of confidence and how terrible it all is. And I think we really need a book that's just a source book of pleasure and says, you could try this, you could try that. And these are some ways that other writers have found pleasure in writing. And this is why these are principles that kind of underlie those different sources and forms of pleasure, and try to help writers, academic writers especially, who have been sort of driven away from a pleasure they might once have felt, to find their way back to it.
I guess many of the images that you showed too of people's writing spaces, which were absolutely lovely, but they were I guess for the most part quite fixed. And there's a question there about people's experiences of, and I love the term, the nomadic writing experience. So people that just, for whatever reason, have to pick up their laptop and go from place to place, almost like hot desking. Did you want to talk about that at all, and how you can still get pleasure from that?
Chapter, or in the book that I've already drafted on writing spaces, and also on social. It's actually in the social chapter, some of that writing about writing with and in the company of others, and then writing alone. And both can give pleasure. And there's a real range of how people like to work. So some people, and I know this also from interviews I've done, some people want a space that's very protected and cocoon-like. And others love being nomadic and love being in different kinds of spaces. I belong to that latter category. And I think something like, COVID lockdowns challenge that. You don't have that range of spaces anymore. But even in the most lockdown circumstance, people were finding ways to move around within an apartment or to go outside. The one with the ironing board, I just love that. That was somebody who just wanted to get outside, and that was the only way they could figure out how to do it. But I guess I would say the advice I would give in the book is to unpack be conscious of where your pleasure comes from. And if you're conscious that being a nomadic writer is really important for you, and not just pleasurable, but maybe spurs you to new forms of thinking whenever you go someplace else, or different kinds of spaces spur different kinds of thinking, that is just golden knowledge. And I would just go with that then. Use that as a way of setting up your days, as much as you can. And if you're somebody who really wants that cocoon, embrace it, focus on it, and try to make it possible.
Fantastic. I'm just aware of the time, Helen. So there's a few more chat questions in there, but we can save the chats, I believe. So there'll be an opportunity perhaps to respond afterwards. But I am sort of aware of the time and would like to pass it over to Barbara if that's all okay for everybody.
Can I just say one thing in there? I might just put a pitch in for through my website, either of the websites, helensword.com or writersstart.com. You can sign up for my newsletter. And one thing that I could do is collect the chat as a newsletter item. So with a link to the video, because I know there were a few people on my list who are like in the UK and just couldn't watch this live, but also a way to pick up some of those questions and answer them in one of the newsletter posts.
Fantastic idea, yeah.
Helen, thank you so much. It has been brilliant and it's been inspirational. I have to say I enjoyed the bit about the analog versus the digital, and where you get pleasure that even on the computer, it could be the flow of ideas that are intellectual, but even the physicality one where it's slower and more pleasurable. But one of the things I did want to say is I loved your website. What really stood out is the color and it kind of made you smile, all the different pictures. It was lovely. Look, the space of pleasure, the emotional uplifting, the idea that undergraduates don't enjoy writing with pleasure, that was a bit concerning. And all your different examples. I'm just going quite speedily here because I know that people are starting to log off, but thank you so much. And I'm sure I can say on behalf of everybody, it was valuable and it was worthwhile and inspirational. So thank you, and motivational. Thanks, Helen.
I can say it was a pleasure. Thank you for inviting me.
All right. Okay.
And I can tell you how I always like to end. I always like to ask people to turn their camera back on, wave goodbye, maybe say a goodbye in the chat, and then exit yourself so that we don't have to be the ones who push the red button.
Well, I'm not sure if you can see me or not, but my screen's suddenly gone black, so I don't know.
You sort of, I can see you still, but you're sort of slightly frozen, or
yeah, no, my screen's gone completely blank. I can't see anybody.
Right, I'm seeing lots of goodbyes.
Okay, well that's good because
People up late in North America.
Rob, can you stop the recording because I can't get onto it? Or Helen, can you click it?
Yeah, I think so.